Hey everyone, and welcome to the first episode of the Wrongfully Heard Podcast.
Found new scientific evidence proving her innocence.
And wrongfully convicted. In this case, nobody got justice.
Was wrongly convicted of a
miscarriage of justice.
I am so excited and grateful for everyone watching right now. Thank you for joining. I hope you are ready for this podcast. It's gonna be a long one, so grab a drink, grab a snack, sit back, relax, and let's get into it. This is the Wrongfully Heard Podcast, where we uncover stories of people who have been silenced, overlooked, stereotyped, and wrongfully convicted. And the purpose of this podcast is to bring their voices back so they are not forgotten and this mistake doesn't keep happening. I am your host, Kaylee, and I am so excited to be doing this podcast and finally starting it up. It has been in the mix for a long time. I have a background in psychology, criminology, and justice, and I am going to continue into my master's next year. I have worked a little bit in the Innocence Project space, where we have looked at wrongful convictions. That is where I first discovered my passion for talking about wrongful convictions. Where are we now? This podcast is not a typical crime podcast. I'm not going to be really talking about what happened so much, more why it happened and what injustices happened. Okay, and the reason I'm doing this is because wrongful convictions are more common than we think. They're not, the big ones are shown in the media a lot. However, the little ones, they get overlooked. And I also think there's a misconception that when people are exonerated, that justice is restored. No, as soon as you're wrongfully convicted, justice is never restored and your life never goes back to the way it once was. Wrongful convictions don't come out of nowhere. They come out of stereotyping, biases, media, police coercion, and a lot of different human-made problems. Today we're going to be talking about one of the most famous wrongful conviction cases to have ever happened, which is the case of the Exonerated Five, where we talk about Kevin Richardson, Antron McRae, Raymond Santana, Yusuf Salaam, and Corey Wise. This is going to be a good one, but also a long one and a very emotionally hard one to listen to. So trigger warning, this episode will be talking about explicit topics such as rape, sexual assault, abuse, robbery, different crimes like that. If you are needing help, if you want to talk to someone about any issues that you are going through, please do. There will be a link in the description for places for you to go. I will try and make it universal. I will do one for Australia and I'll do one for other parts of the world. Please let me know what are the best helplines in different parts of the country that I can link, but I will do my research. Okay, so 5 boys, New York City, place of prejudice and discrimination, place where media is taken off. Let's talk about the environment. So we are going to be splitting this podcast into a lot of sections today. I will put them up right here. This is the timestamps. Everything will be right here. Okay. Section 1, New York City, 1989. So to understand this case, we need to understand the environment, a world that they lived at the time, so we can understand why things happened in the context that they did. So New York back in 1989 was not the same New York as we envision in our minds today. So back in 1989, there was a huge crime increase, lots and lots of crime happening in the area. There was the crack epidemic, which also caused more crime. They had a lot of pressure on police, a lot of cases that they had to work on. They also had the media frenzy, which had taken off as well, where they like to cover a lot of crime and dramatize it a lot, because that's what people wanted to watch. Who wants to watch something boring? Let's put on the most dramatized thing in the morning from when you wake up on the news. So that is why they did it. So obviously all of this, people were scared, people were talking about it, people had their opinions, and people had their stereotypes of who were committing these crimes. So Central Park, we envision it today as this peaceful place where people go for walks. They have ice skating at Christmas. It's a very big tourist attraction. I was actually there this month and it was beautiful. However, back in the day, it was quite dangerous. People labeled it as the crime hotspot. People did not go there late at night because it was so dangerous. And yeah, the media constantly portrayed it as somewhere to avoid and somewhere not to go. And yeah, that was a time where media was amplifying everything, and the media were actually using racialized terms and language in their news reports and stereotyping people as people most likely to commit these crimes. And unfortunately young African American and Latino children, more teenagers were getting stereotyped into this group of dangerous, more likely to commit crimes, and they were labeled as criminals before they were labeled as children, which is absolutely horrible, because not every single teenager is a criminal, and we know this. This atmosphere is what the Exonerated Five were pulled into. This was the community that they relied on for justice to be served. They did not have a chance from the get-go. Section 2. The night of the crime. So it was April 19th, 1989, a warm spring evening. A group of teenagers, mostly African American and Latino teenagers, age around 14 to 18, head into Central Park. Around 9 o'clock, a cyclist was approached aggressively. There was a bunch of different situations. So that was 9 o'clock, and that cyclist was left assaulted and left unconscious. Around 9:12 to 9:15, a couple on a bike were menaced. At 9:24 to 9:45, a taxi man had rocks thrown at him at his car and then was verbally assaulted. At around 1:30 a.m., two pedestrians were walking through the park and found a woman unconscious. This woman was 29 years old. She was beaten pretty badly, bruising, scratches, and abrasions all over her body, and a massive hit to the head. Her radio, headset, and keys were missing. She was alive, but she was in very critical condition. When she was found, the city erupted in fear, and the NYPD were under enormous pressure to find anyone to blame. Section 3, the police response. Within hours, the police began rounding up people, mostly African American, Latino children, teenagers who were at the park that night. Not because they had any evidence to work from, because they were looking for someone to blame. Normally in a police investigation, they would start at the crime scene, looking through things and getting clues to who the suspect should be, or suspects. This way they worked. In this case, they worked from the outside in, which is, one, highly ineffective because half of the people you're interviewing, it's kind of a waste of time, they weren't even involved. Second, it can obviously lead to very many mistakes, as it did. And third, it's costly, time-consuming, a waste of police resources, and it just doesn't make any sense. The boys were brought in for questioning. Some were picked up for minor incidents. Others were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. This is where the story begins to unravel. Section 4. Inside the interrogation rooms. The interrogations were not only long, they were aggressive and completely coercive. Some boys didn't even have a parent present. These were 14 to 17-year-old boys. These boys could not handle that kind of stress, that kind of pressure, that kind of power imbalance between them and the interviewer. That kind of pressure is what causes injustices. And telling the kind of coercive tactics that these policemen used were telling the boys to just explain what they did, explain what they did and didn't do, when some of them weren't even there. They were suggesting details, saying, oh, if you had hit this lady on the head, how would you have done it? Kind of stuff like that. Lying about what other people had said. So, say for example, they were talking to Corey and they're like, oh, Raymond said you didn't commit the act, but you held her down. And if you say you held her down, you can go home. It's like, then Corey may have said, yeah, I held her down, so he could go home. He was in a lot of pressure. If someone says, if you say this, you can go home after being in a room for hours, probably 12 hours, any child would choose to do that because they just want to go home. They want to go home to their beds. They want to go sleep. They want to be with their families. They don't want to be in a police room. The police were playing on fear, exhaustion, and confusion. This is where my psychology background comes into it. If you have a 14-year-old boy in the room, their brain is not fully developed. So they want to please authority figures. They want to stop the extra pressure that they have. They don't understand the long-term consequences of what they are saying. So if a policeman says, if you say this, you can go home, they're just going to think, okay, I'll say it and I'll go home. They're not going to think, oh, in a month, I'm going to have a court date and this is going to be used against me. What 14-year-old would have the reasoning to think of that? Especially back in the day when police and legal rights weren't really explained to children as much. So yeah. And eventually, after hours of interrogation, every boy made a statement. But their statements didn't match each other. They were all making up stories because clearly they didn't do it. But they were making up stories and bringing everyone in because the police were giving them names to fit into their stories. And none of the timelines match, none of the stories match, and none of the physical evidence matched. Yet, the police used this as the truth, and the prosecution did. Section 5, the media frenzy. Once the confessions were public, the media exploded. Headlines were calling these boys Wolfpack, which is disgusting. They were calling them names, giving them false narratives that weren't even true, not understanding the circumstances which this all uncovered in. Their photos and names were put out into the media. They were receiving death threats. They were being told that they should be executed. So yeah, these were children, but the city saw them as monsters. And this media storm made a fair trial impossible. So what I mean by the media making a fair trial impossible, when you have such a public case, it is pretty obvious that most of the town of New York would have seen this. It was headlined everywhere. It was emphasized on news channels, on newspapers, on everything. When you're picking out a jury for this kind of case with such a big media case, you almost don't want a jury as a defense because everyone knows what you did because of the papers, and the papers are dramatizing it and saying that you did this when they hadn't been proven guilty yet, but the papers made them look guilty without even having a fair trial. And the same with the judge. Judges aren't free from bias. Everyone has bias. So they were not in a good spot from the get-go. So in the court, the prosecution relied heavily on those confession tapes that they filmed, even though they contradicted each other. In the trial, they had a joint trial, 2 joint trials. So they had 3 of the kids. They had Antron, Yusuf, and Raymond in a joint trial, and then they had Corey and Kevin in a second joint trial. There are some pros and cons to a joint trial. Some of the pros would be it is cost effective, it is time effective, it would also, in this case where all of the kids have different narratives, would try and keep them similar in a way. But in the defense side, the cons to a joint trial is that, one, if one of those children were guilty and had compelling evidence against them, then the other 2 look guilty by association. And then, there's just a bunch of negative things about joint trial. The jury may not understand the separateness of the case, what DNA evidence belongs to who, and keeping track in this and of the other. It would just be very messy. So June 15, 1990, they had the first trial with Antron, Yusuf, and Raymond. And there was no DNA match, no physical evidence, no consistent story, but the confessions were enough. These boys were convicted of assault, rape, robbery, and riot, but acquitted on attempted murder and sodomy. While Kevin and Corey they also didn't have DNA evidence, physical evidence, or a consistent story, but they were charged. Richardson was charged with everything, every single thing that he was convicted of. And then Corey Wise was convicted of 1 count of assault, 1 count of sexual abuse, 1 count of riot. And so, it was heartbreaking that day. Their childhoods were over. Section 7, Life After Conviction. Prison is devastating for everyone, but for a child, it is something else entirely. Imagine, as a child, you are basically brought up with your family. You basically are still helpless because your family are doing everything for you till that age, and then you are just alone in a room. probably these children were in protection, solitary confinement, stuck in their little areas, isolated, just with their thoughts. Each boy faced trauma, violence, and isolation. However, Corey Wise he suffered the most. He was 16 at the time, so he was sent to an adult correctional facility. He endured years of brutality, years of solitary confinement, and years of survival, and yet he was also the one who would unknowingly help bring the truth to light. Section 8, the real perpetrator. Years later, while serving time at the Auburn Correctional Facility, Corey was actually put in that same facility with the real perpetrator. His name was Matthias Reyes. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, but yeah, he was a convicted murderer and a serial rapist. Matthias was, 1, scared that Corey would find out, and 2, he actually felt guilty that he went to the state prosecution, and confessed to the whole thing. He said he was the sole perpetrator. He was the only one that did it. That the other guys didn't do it. So his DNA was taken for a sample. He was videoed for his confession, and everything matched. The evidence, the DNA, and the story matched. So, yeah. So when you think of it, if one person did this whole crime, which is what happened, how was 5 people convicted? Because they had 1 sample of DNA from the cervical swab and from evidence on a sock, and they both matched to that same DNA. There was no other DNA. Why was 5 people convicted for a crime that clearly only took place by 1 person? And why were 5 people charged when none of their DNA matched with the cervical swab? I can't understand how any of those boys were charged with rape. So yes. So in 2002, the convictions were vacated. The boys, who were now men, were officially exonerated. You may think, oh, happy ending. No. The aftermath, Section 9. So the city awarded them to a settlement. I think it was around $20 million, but it was split with all of them. I'm not sure about that. I need to double check. But money cannot return years of stolen childhood, of life, of time without family. It cannot ease trauma, and it cannot give them back what they lost. And actually, after their exoneration, they were still viewed as guilty by a lot of people in the media. I'm not going to say who is the main person that still believes they're guilty, because I'm pretty sure you all would know by checking the media. But that is horrible. That is horrible that after they were exonerated based on the fresh evidence, the evidence was brought into court. You can't just get exonerated because someone confessed. You need certain requirements, and they matched every requirement that they needed to be exonerated. But people still did not believe them, because they still had this view that because they confessed meant they were guilty. However, where am I going with this? Sorry. This happens a lot, where people come out of prison after being exonerated. They still don't get jobs. They still can't get their life back on track. Luckily enough, eventually, these men got their lives turned around, and now they actually use the trauma, they use their experience, and they help other people who have been wrongfully convicted. They work with the Innocence Project. Corey Wise has his own project with one of the universities in America, which I even applied for because I think it's so cool. But yeah, it is really, really amazing what they have done with what they've experienced. But they rebuild their lives, but their scars will always remain. And yes. And if you haven't watched the series When They See Us, that is a really good capture of what they went through, because they actually worked with the director to highlight and capture everything they went through during that time. So I highly recommend you watch that, and also follow like the Innocence Project, all of that. Keep in touch with what they're doing for the project. Anyway, this is my closing statement. So this case is not just about 5 boys. It is a system shaped by fear, bias, and pressure. It is about how quickly truth can be overturned by a narrative, and it is about how vulnerable children are when the justice system fails them. Wrongful convictions do not happen in isolation. They happen in environments where certain people are seen as believable and some aren't. Such categories such as people in poverty, people of different race, people of different gender, people of different ages. And this is why the Wrongfully Heard podcast exists. To bring these stories to light, to never forget the injustices that happen so that they never happen again. It is to honor the people who were once silenced, and to remind us that justice is not automatic. It is something we have to fight for. Thank you so much for listening to episode 1 of the Wrongfully Heard podcast. I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed. Please actually drop a comment or head over to my TikTok and drop a comment. Tell me what cases you want me to cover next. I have a few lined up, but I will get to yours eventually. And yeah, follow me at Wrongfully Convicted Podcast or Wrongfully Heard Podcast on YouTube, Spotify, TikTok, and yeah, thank you so much. Join me next time as we continue to uncover the stories that demand to be heard.